On a Wednesday morning in October of 2009, Dale Merritt sat across a metal desk from a man named Kevin Sorrells in the regional office of Great Plains Crop Insurance in Salina, Kansas, and listened to Kevin explain, with the practiced efficiency of a man who has delivered this kind of news many times before, why the hailstorm that had destroyed 40% of Dale's soybean crop 2 weeks earlier did not qualify for a payout under the terms of Dale's policy. Kevin had a folder open on the desk. He had photographs, weather data, field assessments. He had the language of the policy printed on a single page and highlighted in yellow. He said the words "outside the coverage window" and "not consistent with the documented loss threshold," and "we understand this is disappointing," with the smooth precision of a man reading from a script he had memorized years ago. Dale listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He asked one question when Kevin finished. "Can I have a copy of the full policy? Not the summary, the full document." Kevin looked at him the way people look at someone who has just asked for something that nobody ever asks for. "Sure," he said. "Of course." He printed it out. 41 pages. He slid it across the desk in a manila envelope and said he was sorry it had worked out this way and that Dale was welcome to call the office if he had any further questions. Dale took the envelope, thanked Kevin Sorrells, and drove home. He did not open the envelope that evening. He set it on his kitchen table and looked at it while he ate supper alone, the way he had eaten supper alone for 3 years since Janet had died. He looked at the envelope the way a man looks at something he knows is going to require his full attention, and who understands that full attention requires rest first. He went to bed at 9 o'clock. He got up at 4:30, the way he always got up. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened the envelope. "Let me tell you about Dale Merritt, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did with those 41 pages. Dale was born in 1951 in McPherson County, Kansas, the second son of Harold and Ruth Merritt. Harold farmed 640 acres of wheat and milo that his own father had broken from prairie sod in the 1920s. The land was flat and productive and unforgiving in the way that Kansas land is unforgiving, which is to say that it rewarded patience and punished carelessness and did not distinguish between the two based on how much a man deserved one or the other. Harold Merritt was not a reader. He was not uneducated. He had finished high school in 1942 and spent 2 years at Kansas State before the war called him to the Pacific. He came back in 1945 with a Bronze Star and a knee that ached in cold weather and took over the farm from his aging father and never left McPherson County again. Harold's relationship with paperwork was the relationship that most farmers of his generation had with paperwork, which was to say that he signed what needed to be signed, kept what needed to be kept, and trusted that the men on the other side of the desk were not in the business of deceiving him. In 1968, Harold signed a crop insurance policy with a regional carrier. He signed it in the kitchen of the farmhouse with the agent sitting across from him at the same table where Dale now sat reading 41 pages in the 4:30 morning quiet. Harold signed where the agent showed him to sign. He put the policy in a drawer with the other documents he kept but did not read: the deed, the equipment titles, the grain storage contracts. He paid his premium every year. He filed one claim in 1973 when an early freeze took his wheat. The claim was paid. Harold trusted the system because the system had worked once. In 1979, Harold filed a second claim, a drought year. The wheat had come in at 30% of normal yield. Harold called the agent, filled out the forms, and waited. The claim was denied. The reason given was that the policy contained a deductible provision that reduced the payout to zero once it was applied to Harold's yield history. Harold did not understand what yield history meant in this context. He called the agent. The agent explained it in terms that Harold understood to mean the company was sorry but there was nothing to be done. Harold accepted the denial. He was 61 years old and tired, and the drought had taken more out of him than just the wheat. He sold 200 acres the following spring to cover operating costs. He never filed another insurance claim. He never read his policy. He paid his premiums until he retired in 1984 and handed the remaining 440 acres to Dale. Dale was 33 years old when he took over the farm. He was not his father. He had gone to Kansas State himself, finished his degree in agricultural economics, came back to McPherson County and farmed alongside Harold for 6 years before Harold's hands gave out. Dale had watched his father lose 200 acres to a denied insurance claim that Harold had never understood and never challenged. He had been 28 years old when it happened. He had asked Harold if he wanted to fight it. Harold had said, "What's the point, Dale? They've got lawyers and we've got nothing." Dale had filed that answer away, not with anger. Harold wasn't a man who inspired anger. He inspired the kind of quiet determination that comes from watching a good man accept a bad outcome without understanding he had any other choice. Dale took over the farm in 1984 and did one thing his father had never done. He read his crop insurance policy, all of it. Every year when the renewal came, he read it again. He kept a notebook where he wrote down the clauses he didn't understand and looked them up, one by one, in agricultural law references he ordered through the library. He became, over 25 years, the kind of man who understood what he had signed. The neighbors thought it was excessive. The insurance agent thought it was mildly inconvenient. Dale thought it was the minimum requirement of a man who had watched his father lose 200 acres to 3 words buried on page 9 of a document Harold had never opened. Now let me tell you about the October morning when Dale sat at his kitchen table with 41 pages and a cup of coffee. Because what he found in those pages was the thing that Kevin Sorrells had not expected him to find. Dale read slowly. He was not a fast reader of legal documents. He had learned that fast reading of legal documents was how his father had lost 200 acres, so he read every word. And when a word was unclear, he wrote it in his notebook. And when a clause was complex, he read it twice. It took him 4 hours. By 8:30 in the morning, he had read all 41 pages and had 7 items written in his notebook. And one of those items was underlined twice. The item that was underlined twice was in Section 14, subsection C, paragraph 4 of the policy. It was not highlighted in the single page Kevin Sorrells had shown him across the metal desk. It was not in the summary document the agent had given him when he signed the policy 3 years earlier. It was on page 27 of 41 pages, in a font size that was technically readable and practically discouraging. The clause read, "In the event of a disputed claim determination, the policyholder retains the right to request an independent field assessment by a certified agricultural loss adjuster of the policyholder's choosing, at the company's expense, provided such request is made in writing within 30 days of the initial denial." Dale read it again. Then he read it a third time. He had 30 days from the denial. The denial had come 7 days ago in Kevin Sorrells' office. He had 23 days left. He picked up the phone and called Kevin Sorrells. "Kevin," he said when the agent answered, "I've been reading my policy." Kevin said something professional and non-committal about being glad to answer any questions. "Section 14, subsection C, paragraph 4, Dale said. "The independent assessment clause. I'd like to exercise that right." There was a pause on Kevin's end that lasted just long enough to tell Dale that Kevin had not expected this particular call. "Mr. Merritt," Kevin said, "that provision is generally used in cases where there's a significant dispute about the physical evidence of loss. My 40% soybean loss is a significant dispute about physical evidence," Dale said. "I'd like to exercise the provision. I'll put the request in writing today. What address should I send it to?" Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been on the receiving end of a system that assumed you hadn't read the fine print? Not because they lied to you, not because they were criminals, but because every single process, every summary sheet, every highlighted page had been designed around the assumption that you would not read the full document, and that assumption was so deeply built into the operation that the people running it had forgotten the full document said anything different from the summary. That was what Kevin Sorrells was experiencing on the other end of that phone call. He had spent 6 years as a claims adjuster and then 4 years as a regional agent, and in those 10 years he could count on one hand the number of policyholders who had invoked Section 14, subsection C, paragraph 4. It was in the policy because a class action settlement in 1991 had required it to be there. It was in the policy in the smallest readable font because nobody at Great Plains Crop Insurance wanted policyholders to find it. And nobody at Great Plains Crop Insurance had told Kevin about it specifically because Kevin's job was to process claims within the existing framework. And the existing framework assumed that policyholders did not read page 27. Dale Merritt had read page 27. Kevin gave him the mailing address. Dale wrote his request that afternoon on a single sheet of paper, cited the section and subsection and paragraph number, stated clearly that he was requesting an independent field assessment at the company's expense within the 30-day window, signed his name, made a photocopy, mailed the original, and put the copy in the manila folder with the 41-page policy. Let me tell you about the independent adjuster, because she is the person who changed everything. Her name was Patricia Holden. She was 53 years old and had spent 22 years as an independent certified agricultural loss adjuster working across Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. She drove a truck with a dented rear quarter panel and kept her assessment equipment in a hard case in the bed. She had assessed storm damage, drought damage, flood damage, pest damage, and fire damage. She had worked for insurance companies, for plaintiffs in insurance disputes, and for federal arbitration panels. She was, by the assessment of everyone who had worked with her, completely indifferent to whose side she was supposed to be on. She assessed what was there and wrote what she found. Great Plains Crop Insurance had used Patricia before. They preferred adjusters who were more flexible in their interpretations. Patricia was not flexible. She was precise, which made her expensive and reliable, and for Great Plains Crop Insurance in cases where the truth was complicated, inconvenient. But the policy said the policyholder's choice of adjuster. Dale had found Patricia's name through the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Certified Adjuster Registry. He had called her, explained the situation, asked if she was available. She was. He gave her name to Kevin Sorrells as his chosen adjuster. Kevin passed the name up the chain. The chain approved Patricia because they were required to approve the policyholder's choice, and because they assumed, in the way organizations assume things they have always gotten away with assuming, that the assessment would confirm the original determination. Most independent assessments did. Most independent assessments were conducted by adjusters who had long-term relationships with the carriers who paid them. Patricia Holden had no long-term relationship with Great Plains Crop Insurance. She had one prior assessment for them 4 years ago that had contradicted their determination and resulted in a $68,000 payout they had not wanted to make. Patricia drove out to Dale's field on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Dale had mailed his request. She spent 4 hours in the field. She photographed everything. She took soil samples. She measured the damaged area with a GPS unit. She pulled insurance company weather data and compared it to National Weather Service records. She wrote her report in a way that was, by her own description, exactly what she saw and nothing else. The report concluded 3 things. First, the hailstorm on October 4th had occurred within the coverage window. The company's determination that it was outside the window was based on a timestamp error in their weather data that had been corrected by the National Weather Service 12 days after the storm. The corrected data, which was publicly available, placed the storm within the coverage window by 40 minutes. Second, the loss assessment conducted by the company's own adjuster had measured only the eastern portion of Dale's fields, which had sustained lighter damage. The western portion, which had taken the heaviest impact, had not been assessed. The total crop loss, when properly measured, was 62%, not 40%, and exceeded the loss threshold in the policy by a significant margin. Third, and Patricia's report was direct about this in a way that company-employed adjusters rarely were. The original denial appeared to have been based on incomplete field data and incorrect weather data, both of which had been available for correction at the time of the determination. Patricia mailed the report to Dale and a copy to Great Plains Crop Insurance on a Monday morning. Dale received his copy on Wednesday. He read it at the kitchen table. Then he called Kevin Sorrells. "Kevin," he said, "I've received the independent assessment report." Kevin said he had received it as well and that the company was reviewing it. Dale said, "My policy, Section 8, Subsection A, Paragraph 2, requires the company to respond to an independent assessment within 15 business days with either a revised determination or a written explanation of why the original determination stands. He paused. I'll expect a response by the 15th. There was that pause again. The pause Kevin made when Dale cited a section number. We'll be in touch, Mr. Merritt, Kevin said. Now let me tell you about the 15 days. Because they were not comfortable days for Great Plains crop insurance. Patricia Holden's report had a problem for the company that went beyond Dale Merritt's individual claim. The timestamp error she had identified in the weather data was not an error that affected only Dale's storm. It was a systematic error in the data feed the company used for weather verification in the western Kansas region. It affected every claim that had been evaluated using that data source in the previous 14 months. Patricia had noted this in a footnote of her report, not accusatorially, just as a factual observation, the way she noted everything. The company's legal department read the footnote. The company's legal department then spent 14 of the 15 days doing something they had not planned to do in October, which was reviewing 14 months of weather-verified claim denials in the western Kansas region to determine how many of them shared the same timestamp error. The number they found was 37. 37 denied claims, 37 policyholders who had been told their losses fell outside the coverage window. 37 denials based on weather data that had since been corrected by the National Weather Service. On the 15th day, Kevin Sorrells called Dale Merritt. Mr. Merritt, he said, the company has completed its review of the independent assessment. We are reversing the original determination. Your claim will be paid in full, based on the 62% loss figure documented by Ms. Holden. You'll receive the settlement paperwork within 5 business days. Dale said thank you. He wrote down the call time and date in his notebook. Is there anything else? Kevin asked. Dale said, Kevin, the timestamp error in your weather data. How many other claims were affected? There was a long pause. That's something the company is reviewing internally, Kevin said. Dale said, Section 16 of my policy, the dispute resolution section. It includes a provision about systemic errors that affect multiple policyholders. I'd encourage the company to review that section as well. There was the longest pause yet. We'll be in touch, Mr. Merritt. Let me tell you about what happened next, because the story does not end with Dale's check. Great Plains Crop Insurance's internal review of the 37 affected claims was not voluntary. Dale had found Section 16 because he had read all 41 pages at 4:30 in the morning, and Section 16 did not require him to file a complaint or hire a lawyer. It required him only to notify the company in writing that he believed a systemic error had affected multiple policyholders, and it required the company, upon receiving such notification, to conduct a review and report the results to the Kansas Insurance Commissioner within 60 days. Dale mailed his notification the day after Kevin's call. He cited the section number, the subsection, the paragraph. He attached a copy of Patricia Holden's report with the footnote highlighted. The Kansas Insurance Commissioner's Office received Great Plains Crop Insurance's review report 58 days later. The report documented 37 denied claims. 22 of those claims were still within the statutory period for appeal. The remaining 15 were outside the statutory period but within a separate provision that allowed reopening in cases of company error. All 37 were reopened. 29 resulted in revised payouts. The total additional payment across all 37 cases was just over $400,000. The Kansas Insurance Commissioner's Office issued a formal finding that Great Plains Crop Insurance had failed to maintain accurate weather verification data and had not corrected that failure when the data discrepancy became known. Great Plains Crop Insurance paid a fine of $60,000. They contracted with a different weather data provider. They updated their claims review process to include mandatory cross-referencing with National Weather Service corrections. Kevin Sorrells was reassigned to a different region, not fired. Reassigned. The company's documentation of the events carefully did not include the specific section numbers that Dale had cited, or the fact that a farmer in McPherson County had read all 41 pages of a document that the company's entire operational framework was built on the assumption that no one would read. Let me tell you about the day Dale drove to his neighbor Vic Cannon's place, because this is the part of the story that matters most. Vic farmed 200 acres to the east of Dale's place. He had been with Great Plains Crop Insurance for 12 years. The same hailstorm that had taken 62% of Dale's soybeans had taken 55% of Vic's corn. Vic's claim had been denied the same week as Dale's, for the same reason, the same timestamp error, the same outside-the-coverage window language. Vic had not read his policy. Vic had called his agent, been told there was nothing to be done, and had spent 3 weeks trying to figure out how to cover his losses without a payout. He had been to the bank, he had sold equipment. He was tired in the way men get tired when they have been working hard and the system has failed them and they do not know they had any recourse. Dale sat at Vic's kitchen table and told him what he had found. Vic listened without interrupting. When Dale finished, Vic said, "Why didn't the agent tell me about the assessment clause?" Dale looked at him. "Because nobody told you to read page 27, he said. Vic was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandfather lost 160 acres to a denied claim in 1961. He never understood why. He trusted the company because they'd always paid before." Dale said, "My father lost 200 acres in 1979. Same reason. He never read the policy." They sat in Vic's kitchen for a while, two farmers in their 50s, with their coffee going cold, thinking about the land their fathers had lost and the documents their fathers had not read. "What do I do now?" Vic asked. "Your claim is being reopened," Dale said. "You'll get a letter from the company in the next few weeks. When you do, read it, every word. And when they send you the new policy renewal in the spring, read that too, all of it." Vic looked at him. "You know most people don't read these things." "I know," Dale said. "That's why most people lose." Now let me tell you about the letter Dale received 11 months later, because it is the kind of letter that confirms why a man gets up at 4:30 in the morning to read 41 pages when the rest of the world would have accepted the denial and moved on. The letter was from the Kansas Department of Agriculture. It informed Dale that he had been selected to participate in an advisory panel on crop insurance policy transparency. The panel had been convened in response to the insurance commissioner's findings from the Great Plains crop insurance case. Its purpose was to recommend standards for policy language, summary documentation, and policyholder notification requirements. Dale served on the panel for 2 years. He drove to Topeka 8 times. He sat at tables with insurance company representatives, agricultural economists, Farm Bureau officials, and government regulators and explained, in the patient way of a man who has spent 25 years reading documents, what policyholders do not know is in their policies and what they would do differently if they did. The panel's final report recommended that all crop insurance policies sold in Kansas include a plain language summary of all claim provisions, including independent assessment rights, attached to the front of the policy document. It recommended that agents be required to verbally explain the independent assessment provision at the time of sale. It recommended that timestamp verification for weather events be cross-referenced against National Weather Service corrections before any coverage window determination. The recommendations became state regulations in 2012. Let me tell you about the last time Dale walked his fields, because it happened on a morning in September of 2015, 6 years after he had sat across a metal desk from Kevin Sorrell's and taken home 41 pages in a manila envelope. He was 64 years old. His knees were starting to tell him what they thought about 35 years of walking plowed ground. He walked slower now, but he walked the same route he had always walked. The east field first, then the south field, then the west field where the soybeans had taken the worst of the 2009 storm. The soybeans were in good shape this year. The crop insurance was paid up. He had read the policy when it renewed in the spring, all 42 pages of the new format, and he had found 2 clauses he didn't understand and written them in his notebook and looked them up. His granddaughter Emma was with him. She was 17 years old. Janet's eyes, Harold's stubbornness, which Dale considered the 2 best things she could have inherited. Emma had been talking about going to Kansas State, agricultural business maybe, or law. She hadn't decided. "Grandpa," she said as they walked the west field, "tell me about the insurance thing again." Dale told her. He told her about Kevin Sorrells and the metal desk and the 41 pages. He told her about Section 14 subsection C and Patricia Holden and the timestamp error and the 37 claims. He told her about Vic Cannon and the advisory panel and the regulations that had come out of all of it. Emma listened the way young people listen when they understand they are being given something important. "Why did you read the whole thing?" she asked when he finished. "Most people wouldn't." Dale stopped walking. He looked at the west field, the long flat rows of soybeans in the September light. He thought about his father and the 200 acres and the 3 words on page 9 of a document Harold had never opened. "Because your great-grandfather didn't," he said, "and it cost him land that had been in this family for 40 years. He handed it to Emma the way Harold had handed it to him. Not the land, the lesson. Not the failure, the reason the failure happened." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So you read everything because he didn't read anything." Dale smiled. "That's it," he said. "That's exactly it." They walked back to the farmhouse in the September morning, the old man and his granddaughter, through fields that were still in the family because someone had read page 27. "Let me tell you one final thing, because it is the thing that matters most." The 41-page policy is in Dale's filing cabinet. He has kept every policy renewal, every claim document, every piece of correspondence from the insurance company for 30 years, in manila folders organized by year. The original 2006 policy, the one that had Section 14 subsection C paragraph 4 on page 27, is in a clear plastic sleeve at the front of the 2009 folder. The page with the independent assessment clause is marked with a yellow sticky note in Dale's handwriting. It says, "Read this first. Emma Merritt is at Kansas State now. Agricultural law." She drives home to McPherson County 3 or 4 times a year and sits at the kitchen table with Dale and drinks coffee and asks questions. Last spring she asked him what he would tell a farmer who had just received a denied claim. He said, "Read the policy, all of it. Not the summary, not the highlighted page the agent gave you. The full document. Every word, because the clause that saves your farm is never on the page they show you. It's on page 27. It's always on page 27. Emma wrote that down, because some things need to be written down, and then passed on, and then written down again. That is how families survive. That is how land stays in the hands of the people who worked it. Not because the system is fair, not because the companies are honest, but because one person, somewhere in the family line, got up at 4:30 in the morning and read all 41 pages when the rest of the world had already accepted the denial and gone to bed. Dale Merritt got up at 4:30. He read every page, and the Westfield is still his. Let me tell you about the winter of 2010, because it is the winter that tested whether Dale Merritt's victory was personal or something larger. The settlement check from Great Plains Crop Insurance arrived on a Tuesday in November, 6 weeks after Kevin Sorrells had made his phone call. It was for the full amount, calculated on 62% crop loss, minus the deductible, minus the premium already paid. Dale looked at the number on the check, wrote it in his notebook, deposited it at the bank in McPherson, and drove home. He did not celebrate. He was not a man who celebrated the return of what had already been his. He did what he always did on November afternoons when the fields were done and the equipment was winterized. He went to his office, opened his filing cabinet, and organized his papers. He put the settlement documentation in the 2009 folder, behind the policy, behind the claim denial, behind the copy of the letter he had sent requesting the independent assessment, behind Patricia Holden's report. He labeled the tab in his careful handwriting, "Settlement, paid in full." Then he made a second folder. He labeled it, "Other claims, timestamp error." He put nothing in it yet, but he made the folder, because Dale Merritt had learned from his father that the time to prepare for what is coming is before you know exactly what is coming. By January of 2010, 11 of the 37 farmers whose claims had been affected by the timestamp error had received notification that their cases were being reopened. Dale knew this because 3 of those 11 were his neighbors and they had called him, not because they were friends, exactly, because word had gotten around McPherson County the way word always gets around in small farming communities, which is completely and without permission, that Dale Merritt was the reason their cases were being looked at again. The calls were awkward, the way calls are awkward when a man needs something from another man and is not sure he has the right to ask for it. They asked general questions about the process. They asked what they should expect. One of them, a man named Gordon Pruitt, who farmed 400 acres of dryland corn north of Galva, asked Dale if he thought they were going to get paid. Dale said, "Read the notification letter they sent you. Not the cover page. The full letter, every paragraph. Then call me back with any questions." Gordon called back 2 hours later. He had 3 questions. Dale answered each one, citing the relevant section of Gordon's policy, which Gordon had finally pulled out of a drawer for the first time since he had signed it 7 years earlier. This became the pattern of that winter. Farmers called. Dale told them to read their documents. They called back with questions. Dale answered. He did not charge for this. He did not consider it a service he was providing. He considered it the same thing Russell Millard had done for the 13 farmers on the bank's list in 1983, which was to stand in the gap between what the system assumed people did not know and what the system was actually required to do if people knew it. By February, Dale had spoken with 19 of the 37 farmers. The other claims folder in his filing cabinet had 19 sheets of paper in it, one for each farmer, with their name, the date he had spoken with them, the questions they had asked, and the relevant policy provisions he had cited. He kept notes because he had learned from 41 pages that documents matter and memory does not. Let me tell you about the meeting in February because it was not something Dale organized or wanted or felt comfortable with. But it happened anyway. Gordon Pruitt called one morning and said there were 8 farmers who wanted to meet. They wanted to sit in the same room and talk through the process together. Gordon had offered his barn. Would Dale come? Dale said he would come. There were 11 farmers at the meeting, not 8. They sat on hay bales and folding chairs in Gordon's equipment barn on a Thursday evening in February with a propane heater running and their breath visible in the cold air. They were men between 40 and 70 years old. They had lost crops to the same storm. They had received the same denial. They had trusted the same system. Most of them had never read their policies. All of them were now holding their policies in their hands for the first time. Dale did not give a speech. He answered questions. What does this clause mean? What is the deadline for this? Can I request the same kind of adjuster you used? If the company offers a partial settlement, do I have to accept it? He answered each question the same way. He found the relevant section in the policy. He read it aloud. He explained what it meant in plain language. He told them what their options were. He did not tell them what to do. He told them what the document said and let them decide. One of the farmers, an older man named Harlan Stutz, who had been farming the same ground since 1961, sat quietly through most of the meeting. Near the end, he said, "Why didn't the agent tell us any of this?" The barn was quiet. Dale said, "Because the agent's job is to sell policies and process claims within the existing system. The existing system works on the assumption that you will not read the full document. If you read the full document, the system has to work differently. Nobody in the system gets paid to tell you to read the full document." Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father signed with this company in 1953. I signed with them in 1978. My son signed with them in 2004. 3 generations. We never read the policy. We just trusted that it covered what they said it covered." Dale looked at him. "Did it?" Harlan thought about that. Then he said, "I guess I don't know. I never read it." "That is the right answer," Dale said. "That is exactly the right answer. Now let me tell you about Patricia Holden, because she becomes important again in a way that Dale had not expected." Patricia had submitted her assessment, written her report, and moved on to her next assignment the way she always did. She did not follow cases after she filed her reports. That was not her job. Her job was to assess and document. What happened after was someone else's business. In March of 2010, Patricia received a letter from the Kansas Department of Insurance. The department was investigating the systemic timestamp error and wanted to interview the adjuster who had first identified it. Would Ms. Holden be available for a formal interview? Patricia called Dale before she responded. Not because she needed his permission, because she had assessed his field and found his footnote had opened something larger than either of them had expected, and she thought he should know. "Dale," she said when he answered, "the state insurance department wants to talk to me about the timestamp error." Dale said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "Nothing. I wanted you to know it's happening. Your 41 pages started something." Dale said, "Your footnote started it." "I just cited the section." Patricia said, "I write what I see. I've been writing what I see for 22 years. This is the first time what I wrote started a state investigation." Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does that change anything for you?" Patricia said, "No. I'll tell them what I found the same way I told it in the report. What I saw in your field. What the weather data showed. What the footnote meant. The same words. They were true in the report and they'll be true in the interview." Dale said, "That's the only kind of words worth using." Patricia said, "I know. That's why I've been doing this for 22 years instead of something easier." They hung up. Dale added a note to the 2009 folder. March 14, Patricia Holden contacted by Kansas Department of Insurance for formal interview regarding timestamp error investigation. He wrote it down because he had learned that the things which matter most are the things that are easiest to forget if you do not write them down. Let me tell you about the summer of 2010, because it is the summer that closed the loop in a way Dale had not foreseen. The Kansas Department of Insurance completed its investigation in June. The formal findings were issued in July. Dale received a copy of the findings in the mail, the same way all affected policyholders received a copy. He read it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with his coffee. The findings were 17 pages. Dale read all 17. On page 11, in a section titled Contributing Factors, there was a paragraph that Dale read 3 times. The paragraph noted that the systemic timestamp error had been present in the company's weather data feed for 14 months. It noted that the error had been identified and corrected by the National Weather Service within 12 days of the initial storm event. It noted that the corrected data had been publicly available for the entire period during which the 37 claims were being evaluated and denied. The paragraph then noted that the error had not been identified internally by Great Plains Crop Insurance during the claims review process, and that it had been identified externally only because one policyholder had invoked the independent assessment provision of their policy and retained an adjuster whose professional standards required her to cross-reference company data against publicly available sources. One policyholder, one adjuster, 41 pages read at 4:30 in the morning. Dale closed the report and sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then he opened the other claims folder and counted the sheets. 26. 26 farmers he had spoken with through that winter and spring. He did not know how many of the 37 had gotten paid. He had not tracked the outcomes. That had not been his purpose. His purpose had been to tell them what the document said. He added one more sheet to the folder. It had the date of the department findings and the page 11 paragraph number and 3 words in Dale's handwriting. The system works. Not because the system is fair, not because the companies are honest, but because the system contains, buried in page 27 of 41 pages, the mechanism for correcting itself if one person reads far enough to find it and cites it correctly, and does not stop when the first pause on the other end of the phone line suggests that the citing of section numbers is unwelcome. The system works when someone reads it. Dale closed the folder, put it in the filing cabinet, and went to his fields. The soybeans were coming in well that summer. He walked the west field in the July evening and looked at the rows the way his father had looked at them and his grandfather before that, with the specific attention of a man who understands that what he is looking at represents everything that has been done correctly and everything that must continue to be done correctly for the rows to be there next year and the year after that. He thought about Harold. He thought about the 200 acres. He thought about a man who had trusted instead of reading and had lost land that had taken 40 years to accumulate because of 3 words buried on page 9 of a document he had signed at the kitchen table where Dale now sat reading every morning. He did not think about Harold with anger or grief. He thought about him the way you think about the person who taught you the most important lesson of your life, even if they taught it by example of what not to do. Harold Merritt had taught Dale Merritt to read. Not because Harold had told him to, because Harold hadn't, and Dale had watched what that cost, and had decided in the specific way that a son decides things by watching his father, that he was going to be different in exactly that one way. The Westfield was still his because Harold had lost the 200 acres. Some lessons cost the person who teaches them everything. Dale walked back to the farmhouse in the July evening and made supper and sat at the kitchen table and opened his notebook and wrote the date and one sentence. Westfield looking good. Soybeans on track. Read the renewal when it comes in August. He wrote it down because Dale Merritt always wrote it down. Because Harold hadn't, and because the difference between those two things was 200 acres and a lifetime of understanding that the document says what the document says, whether you read it or not, and the only question is whether you are the one who knows what it says when the moment arrives that requires you to know.